Today I'll be talking about emotional disturbance. What it is, definition, controversies, classifying, bad news, and the proposed new definition. What it is, 1 in every 5 adolescents exhibit symptoms of emotional distress. 1 in every 10 adolescents can show signs of emotional impairment. In a school that has enrolled 1,000 students, it can be determined that roughly between 180 and 220 students with diagnosable psychiatric disorders such as emotional disturbance. Classifying these students is up to the multidisciplinary team, but performing most of the identification process is normally the school psychologist. More males are prone to being identified than females, up to 80%. African Americans are suggested to be over-identified out of any ethnic or racial groups. Also, students of low socioeconomic status and from single-parent homes are more probable to be classified than other socioeconomic situations. In 1975, Congress enacted the federal definition of emotional disturbance based on Eli Bauer's work in between 1950 and 1960. Brower and his colleagues performed a research study in Los Angeles County schools and developed the guidelines to identifying children in California who shown emotional and behavioral issues that required special needs services. The study that was constructed was on 207 students that had been identified as emotionally disturbed before the study began. The original definition that Bauer created was on the differences between the children identified with ED and their developmental normal classmates based on the teacher's reported data. I have the definition right here for students with emotional handicap and an inability to learn which cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors, an inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers, inappropriate types of behaviors or feelings under normal circumstances, a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, and tendency to develop physical symptoms, pains, or fears associated with personal and school problems. The students have to exhibit one of these characteristics to be eligible for special education, but the symptoms also had to be shown over an extended period of time and to be a marked degree. Also, the child must show that the condition adversely affects their educational performance. There is also a social maladjustment clause, or SM clause, that states the term does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted unless it determined that they have serious emotional disturbance. The S&M clause is a big controversy because it can be one element that stands in the way of a child receiving special educational services or not. Many people don't agree with this because there has never been a single description of social maladjustment that has been universally recognized. Many professionals believe it's vague, weakly defined, which is why it's hard to identify based on the definition. It is believed that roughly 110 to 150 students of every 1,000 are not being identified as ED. When looking at the overall components of intervention, one must look at the multi-methods, the interview, observation, and behavioral rate scale, multi-sources, parent, teacher, child, and multi-setting, which is the home, school, and community. Response to intervention can be used to identify emotional disturbances. As it moves through the tiers, there are so many things to look at. Behavioral severity, that is operationalized by high frequency, duration, and/or intensities is more resistant to intervention than behaviors having lower levels of these behavioral dimensions. The behaviors are more resistant to intervention also can be inclined to generate high rates of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement for the child. The reason that is important is because behavioral severity meets part of the idea's emotional disturbance definition of to a marked degree. A teacher must look at the chronicity of the behavior because in IDEA's requirement it states the behavior has to exist over a long period of time. The RTI model correlates easy with over a long period of time requirement because even though an intervention is taking place, the behavior pattern continues along with it. If a behavior pattern continues at an unacceptable level, then the eligibility determination of the student as an ED might be warranted. The Minnesota Precepto Diagnosis Test provides a determination where a child has an emotional disturbance or other disabilities that they can test with the same test. Principle 1 is where the relationship of the figure and the ground to perception is such that in order for a figure to be seen, the ground must be in homogeneous to the figure, which means that if the figure is black, the background needs to be white so the person can see it. Principle 2 is the interaction of figure ground, where the variation of the ground influences one perception of the figure so that the same figure seen against different grounds appear to change. Principle 3 is the law of grouping, where aside from consideration of the ground, each figure has its own properties, and when certain conditions obtain between parts, proximity, similarities, common fate, a unitary and cohesive figure is perceived. Principle 4 is where there is a tendency for individuals to get decisive structuralization of perceived objects with true orientation. Some of the challenges: a difficulty with identification of students that may be ED is the inadequate time and energy is devoted to identifying them, or they just don't know about the challenges that faces identification of emotional disturbance. These challenges would be the definition being very vague and confusing, also having a lack of knowledge about the nature and scope of emotional disturbance. Bad news. It has been observed students with emotional disturbance compared to other students with disabilities. Students with ED are more prone to be put in a restrictive classroom. According to Merrill and Walker, students with emotional disturbances are in self-contained classrooms with their peers of the same disability or nothing at all. An important thing to do is to identify ED as early as possible, but it really isn't as possible as you would think because you have to wait a long period of time to make one of the classifications of the definition of IDEA. If it's left untreated, the services for a child gets more difficult with age to obtain services that the child would need. Students with emotional disturbance are more likely to drop out of school than a child with other disabilities. After leaving school for a span of 3 years, more than half of the students with ED have had approximately one arrest. The outcome for the students who have identified as ED for special ed services, eligibility continues to be admissible. According to an article from 2004, there is no approximate continuum of services in schools for children with ED. Because there's so much controversy, the Mental Health and Special Education Coalition proposed a new definition. And the definition is right here. The term emotional or behavioral disorder means a disability characterized by a behavioral or emotional response in school so different from appropriate age, culture, and ethnic norms that adversely affect educational performance. Educational performance includes academic, social, vocational, and personal skills, such as disability is more than temporary expected response to stressful events in the environment. It's consistently exhibited in two different settings, at least one of which is school-related, and is unresponsive to direct intervention in general education of child's conditions is such that general interventions would be insufficient. Emotional and behavioral disorders can coexist with other disabilities. This category may include students or youth with schizophrenia disorder, affective disorders, anxiety disorders, and other sustained disturbances of conduct or adjustment where they are adversely affected educational performance in accordance with Section 1. The coalition tried in 1990 to lobby for this definition to get passed, but sadly it was turned down. Even though it wasn't successfully getting into IDEA's definition of ED, it was the new definition for authorizing federal legislation for Head Start. In conclusion, emotional disturbance is a hot topic these days with its controversies of how to classify students that possibly have ED. As people continue to fight for new classifications on how to identify emotional disturbances, many children have left undiagnosed. It's possible that with new classifications and a new definition of what ED is, not only will there be more children diagnosed, but maybe diagnosed faster. The children that are candidates for being diagnosed can be diagnosed through RTI method or Minnesota's Precepto diagnostic test. These are just a few of the things that can be used to classify emotional disturbance. Thanks for watching.